Good evening. Welcome. My name is Donna Schneider. I'm the president of the Prince George's County Historical Society, and thank you for joining us for tonight's history chat. We will be recording tonight's conversation, and if you will please mute yourself, we'd appreciate that. Thank you. We would also like to if you could take your video off, that also helps connections sometimes. So if you wouldn't mind doing that as well, I appreciate that. Thank you. If you have any questions, please add them into the chat box, and at the end of the conversation, we will have Daniel
thinking about her car.
John Peter talk about and answer those questions. This month's conversation will be about the Prince George's County Historic Property Grant Program, or HPGP. Our host will be John Peter Thompson, who will talk about the program with Daniel Tana. He is the planner coordinator in the Historic Preservation section of the countywide Planning Division of Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. The HPGP helps fund rehabilitation, restoration, and preservation of historic properties. The program provides grants up to $50,000 to nonprofit organizations or foundations, political subdivisions, and individuals to preserve, protect, and enhance historic properties, encourage others to preserve, protect, and enhance historic properties, and promote interest in and the study of historic properties. The grant program is administered by the Prince George's County Planning Department of the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission on behalf of the Prince George's County Planning Board. And with that, I will let Daniel and John Peter get going.
Thank you very much, Donna, and thank you, Daniel, for joining me tonight on what I understand is a partially rainy, maybe stormy, or otherwise uneventful July Monday evening. I thought we'd get started before we get into the details of the grant program, just talking a little bit about what is this historic preservation planning section program. In other words, what is it that you do besides this grant? What is historic preservation in Prince George's County?
It's a really good question. And I say this answer, I feel like probably many of the people who are watching and listening know a good amount of what we do, but I grew up in the county, and I've lived here for all but I think maybe 5 years of my life, which I spent very nearby. And I had no idea actually how much or how big of a historic preservation program that Prince George's County had. I certainly didn't know there was a capital grant program that the county administers through the planning department. But the preservation section of the planning department also handles this sort of management and oversight of over 400 locally designated historic sites, a number of locally designated historic districts and some of those also contain a number of other resources which may not be individually designated, but are sort of covered by the local districts. We also have a robust tax credit program that is available to owners of historic sites and people that own properties within those locally designated districts. And sorry, we've got somebody unmuted, I think, in a little crosstalk.
Yeah, Daniel, hang on a minute, because I'm also hearing the same sort of crosstalk here. Donna, are you able to?
No, because it's Gail. It looks like it's Gail Rothrock.
Uh-oh, Gail.
Hey, John.
There we go. Sorry. I'm going to mute you, Gail. Sorry.
Okay, good.
I feel like
I
she
tried.
would be the best person to answer this question, probably. But I'll continue to try to cover it. So I think I left off talking about the historic sites and districts, and the way that we the way that oversight of those properties and places is sort of tangible is that we have a requirement. There's a subtitle of the county code that is our historic preservation ordinance. It's subtitle 29 of the Prince George's County Code, and that delegates the authority to the preservation section of the planning department to regulate these historic sites and districts that are designated at the local level. And so we do that through the historic area work permitting process. Basically, in addition to any normal building permits or other things that you would need to get at the county or municipal level, depending on where you live in the county, if you do own a historic site or property in a local historic district, you're also required to get what's called a historic area work permit for any work that would change the materials or appearance of the exterior of your property, or materially change the landscape or other features of the parcel that it's located on, which we call the environmental setting of the historic site. Man, thunder is getting really rowdy out there. Apologies for any background noise. And so that's the primary thing we do is handle those historic area work permits. We get a lot of them in any given year, and they all get reviewed by staff, who then presents them to the Historic Preservation Commission, which is a county body, and we function as staff to that body as well as planning department staff. So once a month, we present these cases to the Historic Preservation Commission. We also present them with tax credit applications for these historic sites. When they do qualified work, they're able to get tax credit at the local level. There are also development review things that come through the historic preservation section. There's a very large amount of archaeology that gets done in the county that my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Stabler, who has been a previous guest at these history chats, handles pretty much all of that by herself, and sometimes with the help of her Parks Department colleagues if it's on Parks Department property. So she is incredibly busy. And then we have our grant programs, and that's kind of the major stuff. We have two grant programs. The one I'll be talking about tonight, which is our capital grant program, historic property grant program. And that's actually a program of the Prince George's County Planning Board that is administered by the Historic Preservation Section on their behalf. And then we also have the non-capital grant program that's a little bit newer. And that is a program of the Historic Preservation Commission, and we administer it on their behalf. So yeah, we keep busy.
So Daniel, thank you very much. That was really great. But one thing sort of slipped by, which I want to focus on very briefly, because like the grant program, it's a benefit of being in the program, of owning a structure that has a historic designation, and that's, I think you said tax credit. Could you spend
Sure.
just a minute or two on what is it? What tax credit?
So we have a local Prince George's County historic rehabilitation tax credit. A lot of people are probably familiar with the federal historic preservation tax credit that the National Park Service administers. It's similar to that, but different in very meaningful ways, and I think ways that make it a lot more accessible. Whereas the federal level one is accessible only to income producing properties, so businesses, things like that. This is really meant for homeowners. I mean, anyone in the county can use it if they own a historic site and if they pay property taxes, basically, because the tax credit is, you get the credit back on the county portion of your property tax bill. So if you, let's say, own a property that is a historic site, and let's say your property tax bill is $5,000 a year total, and $3,000 of those dollars go to Prince George's County, and the rest is to the state. So bear with me here. I'm going to try to keep these numbers in my head. So that's $3,000 a year you're paying to the county. Let's say you did a tax credit for work that was $100,000 worth of work, just to make the math easy. And all of the work was eligible, and you got the relevant permits that you needed from us, historic area work permits, before you did the work. When that work is completed, you could then fill out a very simple, 2-page application form enumerating the work that you did. And then you include receipts that show that you paid for the work and photos of the completed work. You send that to us, we review it, we present it to the Historic Preservation Commission, and they have the authority to approve a 25% credit. So if it were $100,000 worth of work, which is a lot, I should have said 10. That's probably a more realistic amount of money to spend on that. But regardless, you would then get, in this example, a $25,000 tax credit, which you would use toward that $3,000 portion of your $5,000 total tax bill. And the way it works is that you get it starting the following tax year in which the work was completed. So if you did work right now in late July of 2021, we're in tax year, fiscal year 2022 for the tax year. So you would get that credit beginning in fiscal year 2023 on your property taxes. And the Prince George's County Office of Finance they get paperwork from us after it's been approved, and they apply that to your tax bill, and you either get a refund or if you've already paid the taxes. Because the great thing about this program is that, let's say you did some work this year in 2022 and you just kind of forget about it. And then in a few years, you remember, oh, I'm eligible for this tax credit. You can go back up to 5 years and actually do the application once the work is completed. And you then, when you start getting the credit, so in this scenario, let's say you're starting to get it in FY 2023, it can carry forward for up to 10 years. So that $10,000 credit is going to apply for 2023, and then 2024, that's 6,000. And then 2025, you'll get up to 9,000. And the last year you would use it as the fourth year, and you'd have $1,000 left of that balance to apply to your $3,000 a year that goes to the county. So it's a really great program, and it can go up to 10 years. So if you have this huge tax credit, you can just keep applying it for years and years and years until you use it all up, or until that clock ticks down to zero. And you can kind of apply for, multiple ones. So if you have one that's kind of being spent down, and then you do more work, you can just keep applying for them. It's really really good for property owners, because it covers a lot of work that people would be doing anyway. Sort of cyclical stuff like replacing your roof that needs to be done a couple of years and is a really big expense. So it can cover a lot of that. A $10,000 roof, you get $2,500 back off of your property tax bill, which is pretty great for something that, if you own any house, even if it's not a historic site, you're going to eventually need to put a new roof on it. So it's a nice benefit.
So yes, and that's why I wanted you to go there. It is a benefit. So tonight we're going to talk about the master benefit, the big benefit of being a historic property in Prince George's, or maybe enticing you to become a historic property in Prince George's County. And that's the Historic Grant Program, which has a bunch of letters that I can never remember, but you're going to tell us all about it.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, this is a really great program. And again, I was sort of, I don't know, a little bit shocked to learn about it when I, was sort of applying for this job years ago. I knew that the state had a grant program and things like that, but I didn't know that we had one down at the county level. And it's really quite generous, I think. And it is competitive, and the funding is limited, but yeah, it's a very interesting program, and it's unique. I don't think there are many others in the country that are sort of at this local level. But I'll give you some quick background. The grant program was sort of enabled in 2008 by the Prince George's County Council. They passed legislation that enabled the grant program. It provides grants to nonprofit organizations, foundations, political subdivisions, or individuals for the purposes of acquiring, preserving, restoring, or rehabilitating historic properties in accordance with the Maryland Land Use sections 26-101 through 26-107. And that state legislation is also what helps this be possible. And that's important for later when I talk about the easements. So that's why I'm mentioning that now. And then the Prince George's County Planning Board, who is the sort of owner of the program, even though we administer it on their behalf, they passed the program guidelines on May 8th, 2008, and those were revised on July 21st, 2016, and are actually we're proposing some revisions to them in September. So they may be revised again this fall as well. So in the 13 years that the grant program has run, it runs on an annual basis. So every year we have sort of one complete grant cycle that's sort of tied to our fiscal year, which starts July 1. And in the 13 grant cycles that we've had 146 grant awards awarded by the Planning Board. We currently have 45 of those that are still active, so projects that are still ongoing. And in total, the total gross awards that we've given out is $4,408,379.70. And when I was pulling that number together, I thought it was a little curious why it wasn't a more round number. And I'm not sure why that is, because I think in earlier years, there were things like emergency grants that would be very specific amounts of money. So, most years we have a total amount of money that's available, whether it's $300,000 or $350,000, and all of that money is given away. So it's usually a nice round number year to year these days. But yeah, I did also just mention that it is a very competitive grant program. We typically get between, maybe 12 and 25 applications per year. And the number of awards that are able to be awarded to applicants is usually somewhere between 10 and 13, depending. So what happens a lot of the time is that the planning board will, you're typically in the last few years, you've been allowed to request up to $50,000 per award. And, the planning board has the discretion to reduce those awards so that they can spread out the funding to more people. So if you've asked for 50, a lot of the times, we tell people to be prepared to get a little bit less and to, do your project budget in such a way that you can maybe shave off 1 or 2 line items to still have some work that you can do if that happens, because it is the sort of thing where they want to give as many awards that are still meaningful as they can. And like I said, the demand always exceeds the supply, although the funding has gone up in the last year of the program. So maybe we can keep pulling it up if the demand remains high and if people are vocal about that. So yeah, that's some just basic information about the program. Although I guess it's worth mentioning, I mentioned the easements before. That's one of the big sort of things that goes along with the grant program is the easement program that we administer through the historic preservation section. So one of the conditions of the grant program, there are 2. The first condition is that you don't have to be a historic site that is designated at the county level to apply. That is one of the types of properties that can be applied, that you can own and apply for a grant, but there are some others that you can. So if you own a property that is a contributing structure in a National Register Historic District, maybe not locally designated, you can apply for this program. And if you are, because basically by knowing that you're a contributing structure in a National Register District, we know that you could probably be designated as a historic site at the county level. And so that you don't have to do that before you apply, but if you're successful and you are awarded a grant from this program, you will have to go through the evaluation process to become a Prince George's County historic site before you can receive the grant funds that you've been awarded.
And that means you need to be willing to be a historic county site, right?
Right. Which means that you have to be willing to take on, the additional regulatory oversight of the historic area work permit process and things like that. Of course, as we've already noted, that's the sort of stick side of things, and there are quite a few carrots that go along with it. So it's not all bad, and it's arguably not bad even in that respect, which is sort of the con. If there were a pro-con list of things for people to consider.
Daniel, let me bring you back to, let's dispense halfway through the program with the big elephant in the room, the easement.
Yes, we should. And that is a really important one. I try to talk about it early and often when we do these, grant publicity type things, because it is really critical that people know about it going into the program, because the other big requirement is that in order to receive the grant fund, so you can apply, and if you are awarded, in order to kind of move through the process, the property owner then has to donate a perpetual historic preservation easement to the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission, which is the Prince George's County Planning Department's parent entity, this bi-county entity that exists in Maryland. So what that means is that, and we give people many opportunities to change their mind. So it's not so scary as it might sound, but basically how it works in practice is that because you have to be a historic site at some point in this process anyway, and most people who apply already are, and they are already regulated. And so they have that historic area work permit process that I talked about before, where we regulate the exterior of the property and changes to it. Anything outside of ordinary maintenance, we kind of need to have reviewed and approved by the Historic Preservation Commission before it happens. And the way that the easements work, they are almost analogous to that. There are a few key differences. So the first one is that the historic preservation ordinance is obviously a law. So it's something that is, passed by the county council, can be amended by the county council in the future. It could theoretically change or be gotten rid of altogether in the future. It's possible that there could be a council that one day gets together and decides to change subtitle 29 of the county code or weaken it or get rid of it altogether, in which case we may not have the protections that we have currently for all of our historic sites. But for the about 60 historic sites that have gone through this grant program and received easements, or that have donated easements rather to MNCPPC in return for these grant awards, their protections would not change in this sort of hypothetical scenario, because the protections that come from the easement are a private agreement, a private legally binding agreement that is recorded in the land records and runs with the land, is the sort of term of art that we use. And what that means is it's recorded in the land records, it goes on the title of the property. So when you do a title search, when you're, a real estate transaction is taking place and, your title company is doing a title examination for the property that you're thinking of buying, for example, the easement will come up, and hopefully that's not how you find out about it, because hopefully the seller discloses it, which is one of the conditions of the easement. But if they don't, it will come up in these title examinations as well as a sort of encumbrance that is on the title of the property, and it doesn't go away. So if you receive this grant and you donate this easement to MNCPPC in return for the grant, all subsequent property owners are bound to the same terms and covenants of the easement as the original donor. So it's important to consider in that respect. But at the end of the day, it is functionally, I don't think it feels much different. The only except for the property owner, I should say, so you would be applying for your historic area work permit. And if you happen to also be one of these historic sites that has an easement on it held by MNCPPC, when you apply for that historic area work permit, we receive it as staff and we send it to two groups of people instead of one group of people. So instead of just going to the HPC for their review and approval through the historic area work permit process, we also take it, kind of duplicate it, and we gave it to the MNCPPC easement committee, which then reviews the work and using the same set of standards and things like that. And they also either give or deny their approval, and then that letter comes from. So you'll get two approvals for the work, basically.
Yeah, no, I was just saying, before we scare off anybody that's thinking about doing this, most of this is seamless and happens behind the scenes. And I can think of one, maybe two times where the seam kind of shook a little bit, but effectively for the property owner, they didn't notice anything.
Right. Yes.
So
yeah. We do try to make it.
Stop you from cutting the grass. It doesn't stop you from selling the property. It doesn't stop you from planting tulips.
Right. Yes. Gardening is not covered. It's like major changes to, if you had a large property and part of it was, a nice lawn and you wanted to plant it with trees, it's not that is prohibited, but we would want to know the details of that beforehand. That would be approved.
Right.
And similarly, if you had a grove of trees that you wanted to clear cut, we would want to know about that too, because it would be a sort of major departure from the existing conditions.
And we probably want to know about it even if you didn't have an easement.
That's true. Yes, that's right.
This is the point. They kind of overlap, and it's a behind the scenes. Daniel, I want to ask you a little more back to the grant program itself. Can you give, and you have said this a little bit, but so if I need a roof on my historic house, the grant program would cover this. Could you kind of give a list of things the grant money can be used for, and maybe a list of things it couldn't be used for? Some examples.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I guess the easiest way to sum it up, what it can be used for is almost any capital expenses to it. So any brick and mortar work, any kind of, material changes or rehabilitation work to a property is generally eligible. There tends to be because it is competitive, there is certainly more weight given to projects that are sort of integral to the overall preservation and long-term preservation of of a given building or resource. So things like roof are great. And I just want to put a pin in something to come back to. For something like a roof, the grant program, you can obviously apply for that type of work. It's one of the things that comes up where a lot of the time when people go to replace their roofs, they are doing it because they've noticed that there's a problem. Because of the grant program's sort of annual cyclical nature, like if you know you're going to need a roof in the next 2 to 3 years, it's great for that. It's not great if you need one like next month. That's something that I would say, okay, go ahead and get your permit. We'll approve it really quickly, and then you can get a tax credit for your roof because you can do the work and then apply for the tax credit. The grant program is notably a reimbursement program, and because all of that easement stuff has to happen first, if it's something urgent like a roof that is currently leaking, it is not great for that kind of work. And we do usually sort of redirect people to the grant program for things that can't wait. So you sort of unintentionally guided me towards bringing up that point that I wanted to cover. So there, it's for sometimes longer term stuff, because from the moment you apply, which is the application period should open in about August. Usually it opens sometime in August, and we hold grant workshops through the fall. And then our deadline is sometime near mid to late October. And then there's a period where you can amend your application until around Thanksgiving. And then that's it, you're closed. But you can't usually start doing the work until almost a full year later.
I want to come back to those
eligible work.
Well, the date thing, that was my next question. I want to come back to eligible work. So let me try something here. What about chimneys? Falling down, not falling down, repointing, restyling?
Absolutely, yeah. You can certainly apply for that, because it is something that, if a chimney collapses, it would be a great danger, not just to the building, although it would be a danger to the building.
How
certainly.
about gutters?
Gutters are fine. We would obviously like to have them match. If you have a historic, half round gutter or something like that, and apply for a grant to replace them with K-style gutters, we're probably going to push back on that, or you might not be successful in your attempt at funding. But yes, gutters are great.
Windows?
It's absolutely rehabilitation, particularly. We've given a lot of really good rehab grants we've had folks that have come in and say, our old wood windows they're too far gone. We can't do anything with them. And so we want to apply for a grant to buy new windows. And it's very expensive, and that's why we need the grant. And then it turns out that with a little bit of back and forth, it's usually almost more cost effective for them to rehabilitate them with grant funds. And then it makes everybody kind of happier. So
what about, I want a new door on the gable side of my brick house.
Sure.
I'm going to cut a door in.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yes.
Just want to throw
no.
you,
yes,
something
right.
creative.
And that is a very good point. Thank you for leading me down that, putting enough breadcrumbs for me to finally get to that point. But yes, when I said before that the easiest distinction is, if it's capital, then it's probably eligible. New construction, major alterations to a building like that, or doing something like an addition would not be eligible for that. Although that some of those things may be eligible for at least partial tax credit, they would not be eligible for the grant program. It is really focused on rehabilitation. So, and again, I think work that is more, I don't want to say exterior in nature, but building envelope stuff is great because it contributes to long-term preservation. But that can also include things like systems, because if you've got a HVAC system that tanks out and is no longer working, and the building is used to sort of having a stable interior climate, then that's something that can be eligible as well, because it's very important to not let the building suffer through these wide temperature swings. So having a consistent stability, temperature and humidity wise, is really helpful for the long-term preservation of a structure. There was something else I wanted to mention too. And
well, so I want to follow up on that. So a sump pump would probably be something that would be considered favorably. Yeah. But if we were looking at, and I'm thinking of an interior wall that we either want to take down or build that's not a support wall.
Right. right. That would be, because it's kind of inessential to the structure and it's, I mean, I suppose there could be an argument made for if someone were putting back a non-structural wall that they had good documentary evidence that it existed in the past, that would probably theoretically be eligible.
And
Though
what would come with that?
What's that?
That means you'd probably be looking at something, hold the phone, an
Well,
interior
sure, an
easement.
interior easement. Yes, that's
Yes.
right. Because if we give you money and not for everything, if you receive a grant award that includes money for, let's say, an HVAC system, we're not going to put an easement on the interior of your house because of that. If there is a compelling architectural feature that that the planning board awards funds to be used toward the rehabilitation of, that was a really clunky sentence, but I hopefully everybody's following along. Then in those cases, and they're very rare, I think we only have maybe 4 or 5 interior easements, and some of those we probably don't need to have, but earlier on in the program we were a little less we kind of use them a little more than we do now, because now we really try to limit it to one, we want to be making sure that we're giving you funds for something on the interior, and 2, we want to make sure that it isn't something just like an HVAC system. It's something that we really want to actually, it's a real architectural feature that we're preserving. And one of the best examples I can think of that does have interior protections is Bostwick in Bladensburg, where we've got all this old hardware and old plasterwork. I mean, really, a lot of interior features that are sort of, now being protected. So in addition to being a historic site, that property, and the exterior being regulated, we also do annual inspections of the interior of that property. And that's how the easements can sometimes work, depending on what you have received an award for.
Let me do another sort of positive example of what maybe the money could be used for. And then I want to go back to the timeline of applying and workshops and everything. So suppose I have the privilege of having a 19th century farmhouse, and I have more than a quarter of acre, and I have what I call outbuildings or farm buildings. I may use a building to store my car in or a lawnmower or something, but the building is it's not attached to the house directly, and it's about to fall down or it needs some structural work. Are those buildings available? How would they be handled under the grant program?
So in general, yes, if they're part of the historic site. Obviously, if it's a more modern building, then it's, even though it might technically be eligible as part of the historic site, if it's not contributing really in any meaningful way, it will, because there are certain things where work that is eligible may not be successful in getting funding because of the competitive nature of the program. So you might have a building, let's say, that is a little more modern and just not as important, or not from the same time period as the original main structure, or whatever the case may be. Having said that, in general, yes, you can use capital funds for outbuildings at historic sites. We've done that very regularly. I think there are barns and older outbuildings that sometimes they need a lot of work because as a property owner, you're more focused on the main house because that's where you live, and you don't want water dripping in on you while you sleep. And so maybe the barn or the garage or whatever the outbuilding may be gets a little more run down. So we get a lot of applications for buildings like that. And I think, we kind of take them as they come, and the planning board and the various grant committees that review these applications consider them very seriously and earnestly, and look at the work on its merits. And if it is a contributing outbuilding and it is historically significant, you can absolutely get awards to preserve those things because they're an important part of this sort of, whether it's enough of a parcel to be called a historic landscape, but they make up the environmental setting of that property, and they are important to the understanding of it as a historic site. So outbuildings are definitely eligible as well, generally speaking.
One more example, and then we'll go to timeline kind of things. What about cemeteries? Because you don't live, well, wait a minute. the living don't live in cemeteries.
That's right. That's right. We have granted capital grants for cemeteries. There are certain things that could be done in the cemetery that might be better handled by the non-capital grant, but generally, if you're looking at the sort of restoration or rehabilitation of monuments and stones and things like that, that could be considered brick and mortar type work. You know, we have a lot of historic cemeteries in the county that either sort of naturally stones will kind of fall off their bases and then things like that happen. And sometimes it's a result of vandalism, and whatever has caused those conditions, you know, we can certainly award grants for that type of work. There is a one church that I can think of specifically that actually a number of years ago applied for a grant that was completely focused on the cemetery. So the easement, when it was drafted, was only put on the cemetery. You know, we had a property survey, and we outlined where the easement was going to cover, and it was just the historic portion of their cemetery. And then in the last, you know, year or two, they came back and needed to do some repairs to their bell tower, and I think some repointing and stuff too. Some of the mortar was just kind of, you know, coming out as sand when you ran your finger through the joints. And so they came back and applied for another grant, and we did a second easement. So that historic site now has two kind of easements that connect into the whole, you know, they form the entire historic site. And but for a period of time, our easement was only protecting the cemetery. So that portion of the property had the sort of two layers of protection. And now the whole property has that. And so it's just sort of an interesting thing. But yes, cemeteries are definitely eligible. If you're doing things like vegetation removal, things like that, that could potentially be handled by the non-capital grant program in cemeteries. If you know, you're removing like a hazardous tree or some plants that are growing up and, you know, pushing a headstone over or things like that. And particularly if the cemetery is not owned by anyone readily available, they have a lot of ability to fund that type of work in cemeteries. But for brick and mortar stuff, this would be the program for that.
All right, enough examples. Let's talk about how you go about applying. And I'm interested, you mentioned it, but maybe we could go slowly.
Sure.
The grant program for this coming year has actually kicked off officially as of July 1st, right?
No, well, sort of. That's when we find out if there's money available.
Well, yep, that
and
would
then-
be the kickoff.
That's right. Yeah. But so the application forms and stuff like that are not active yet. They are still making their way through the commission, the M&T.
Well, let's answer the first question. Is there money this year?
There is, as far as I have not been told to not put up the application. So
Not
as far
been
as I
told
know,
not to proceed. Okay, so
That's
we're
right, that's right.
assuming there's some amount of money.
yes, I would
for
hope
this
that
coming
someone would have let me know if there wasn't. As far as I know, it is $300,000 again, and we would be people would be able to apply for awards of up to $50,000. It may end up being a little more than that, but I actually
Right.
don't know
Okay.
yet. But we're moving forward, and the application materials have been prepared, which is, you know, all the forms and stuff that people will need to fill out. The workshops have been scheduled, so we do a number of grant workshops. But I guess I'll go through with a little specificity. Generally, we begin accepting applications for this year's, which is actually the FY 2022, because that's the fiscal year we're in. So it's always a little confusing in the fall because you're applying for a 2022 grant, even though it is 2021. So we should have application forms up on the planning department's website sometime in the next week or two, I would think. Once we get everybody's approval to publish those and put them online, they're already ready. So, and then we're going to hold 4 workshops again this year virtually. And the way that works is it's about an hour and a half where anybody can register, and I can put I'm going to put the link to, if anybody's interested in registering for one of these workshops, I just pasted the link to the registration form in the chat. That is live, even though the materials aren't available yet. So, you know, if you want to sign up for one of those workshops and get even more fine-grained detail about this program, the grant program and the easement program, feel free. They're open to the public, and you don't have to apply or anything like that to go to them. So anyway, everything opens up sometime in August, hopefully early August. And then you have a couple of months to attend these workshops, get your paperwork in order, ask me questions, and work on an application. We require that the applications, let me see, open up my calendar here. This year, the deadline for applications is October 22nd, which is a Friday. And by that date, we need to have a reasonably complete application in from people. Because we require things like contractor estimates that sort of back up, the budget for your project. And we know that it can be hard to get those, and contractors are really busy in the summer and into the fall when it's like peak building activity season. So if you can't get all of your estimates in and things like that by October 22nd, there's about another month grace period. You get until November 19th to make revisions to that preliminary application. But after October 22nd, we don't accept any new applications. So if you haven't gotten something reasonably completed in, and we can be pretty flexible with what reasonably complete means. If we're in good communication, and I know you're kind of making a good faith effort to get everything together, we can give people some slack. But then by November 19th, everything has to be in. Your application is kind of locked in on that date, and that is what the various people who score the application will see, is the application as it exists on that date. And I say the people who will score the applications because I, as the program manager, don't actually have anything to do with that. I'm sort of here as a person who compiles the applications and helps the public know about the program and apply for it. I try to help applicants do the best that they can in terms of applying for this program. So even if you don't have any outstanding stuff, if you've submitted everything you needed to by October 22nd, I will, and obviously it depends on the volume of applications, but I've had a pretty good track record of being able to go through every single application that we receive, read through it with some level of detail, fine tooth comb, and get back to the applicants with feedback. And generally that consists of, because these applications are competitive, they are scored. We have a series of criteria that are used to score these applications, and it's worth 100 points total. So, different questions are worth different amount of monies, or different amount of points rather. And some of the points come from things that are just sort of inherent to the property, such as what councilmanic district it's located in, and we try to spread out the funding between different types of resources. So if they're all, of the same type, they might score lower in one or two categories related to that. But the bulk of the points come from what's actually contained in your application. So I try to work with people and get them to have really clear, concise, compelling applications so that when the reviewers are looking through the applications later on and scoring them, your application, we want everything to be pretty standardized, but we also want people to very quickly be able to understand what you're proposing, what you're going to do. We want to make sure your math is all correct in your budgets, that nothing is confusing, and that gives you the best chance possible of getting funding. So that November deadline comes and goes. I start gathering everything together. I make a big PDF binder for the reviewing bodies, the first of which is a subcommittee of the Historic Preservation Commission. It's the grant committee, which meets usually sometime in January, and they sit down and they score all of the applications against each other, and they come up with a total score for each application. Those scores are then presented to the Historic Preservation Commission, usually at its February meeting, where they decide whether or not to alter them or carry them forward and recommend them to the planning board. And then they are presented to the planning board in some form, whether or not they've been changed by the HPC, usually in March of the following year. So in March of 2022, the planning board will hear all of the applications presented to them with the HPC's recommendations, and they make the final decisions on who actually gets grant funding. And they can change the amounts. They can really do whatever they want because it's their program and their funding. And then after that point, we go through, it takes a couple of weeks for us to get the contracts together. Our legal staff will help with that. And then we if you have never been through the grant program before, you have to register as a vendor with MNCTPC, which takes a little bit of time. And once we have vendor numbers for everybody, we send the grants out for signature, you send them back, and then we start working on the easements with everybody. And it's just it's a whole thing. So it takes some time. The contracting has to happen before the end of the fiscal year, so before July. So we know that will happen and the money will get locked in before July. And then the easements can take, anywhere from a couple of months to sometimes a few years, because if you have a mortgage on your property or a lien or anything like that that is recorded on the title, that if you don't have a basically free and clear title to your property, we have to work to get those things resolved so that the easement can be recorded, because the Maryland land use article that enables our program to exist requires that our easements be perpetual. And in order for the easements to be perpetual, they can't be subordinate to a deed of trust or a mortgage or a lien or anything like that that can be foreclosed upon. Because the way that would work is if let's say you have a mortgage on your property and our easement is below it in the recorded order in the land records, if that lender forecloses on your mortgage, then that knocks out the easement and it no longer exists legally. So we have to avoid that possibility, and that usually takes some time to work with lenders. And most of them are amenable to it and come around to it, but it can take a lot of back and forth. So there are a few unknown things, and that's why I say that, if you have a leak in your roof today, don't wait to apply for the grant program, because one, there is no guarantee that you'll get funding, and two, even if you are awarded, it's a bit of a long game. I mean, it's really worth the wait, but it is great for work that is sort of, you're planning ahead a little bit, and stuff like that. So sorry for going on so long.
No, this is, I'm fascinated and really delighted that you're able to go into this detail for us. And
I was going to say, John Peter, we're getting to the time to start asking questions.
okay, I have a question.
Okay.
Can you, and now I want you to be very brief. What's this other grant program? Can you do that in 2 sentences?
I will try. Yes. So it is a program of the Historic Preservation Commission, and it exists largely to sort of fill the gap between, because we have this capital grant program that exists, but for years there was nothing for non-capital historic preservation work, research, things like that. So this program exists to cover that type of work. It can be used for archaeological surveys. It can be used for educational purposes. So if you wanted to do a walking tour of historic sites in your municipality, we've had applications like that come through, exhibits, informative websites, research, oral histories. We just got an application for an oral history. So it's great for all kinds of sort of educational, public benefiting, non-capital work that's related to history and preservation.
All right, well, maybe I'm getting an idea of another chat, and we'll focus on that one. But for now, Donna, do we have questions?
We have questions.
Oh, boy.
So I'm going to start with the first one from Franklin Robinson. He says, thanks, Daniel, for all you do. Could you speak to applying for a grant with regard to looking to purchase a historic property? Do you submit a pending contract for the purchase price, or just what might be different in this situation as opposed to applying for restoration work? Thank you.
That is a great question, Franklin. And it has actually only happened one time in the history of the program. Out of the 146 grant awards, only one has been for the acquisition of a property. And it was before I was here, but from what I understand, it took quite a lot of effort because the program is done on this reimbursement basis, and because the easement has to be recorded first. You can imagine that it is hard to record an easement on a property that the person acquiring it does not yet own. So what happened in that situation was that there was ultimately a settlement that had to be organized, and it included the commission's lawyers and the applicant who was purchasing the property and the person who was selling the property. They all had to be present in the same room at the same time. And it was kind of like 3 hands were on that check kind of thing. So the easement was, the property was transferred, the easement was signed, and then like a check was cut. It was very bizarre from what I understand, having not been there to actually witness it. But so that's sort of how that works. And I think because there's been a lot of change in the commission's legal staff, it might look different if that happened in 2022. So I'm not exactly sure. But yes, I think you would, in terms of what you would submit instead of having contractor estimates, it would probably be, yeah, just the real estate listing or a purchase and sales contract if you maybe had something like that you had signed, with a potential seller saying, and maybe you can even, depending on the seller and how sympathetic they are, maybe it could be conditional on if the contract could have language in it that's if this person is successful in obtaining a grant award for the acquisition, then this contract is valid and yada yada yada. That could certainly be one way that it looks. But I think it's pretty open because it is so rare in the program's history. We don't have a ton of precedent for how it would work. But it's certainly something we would figure out. And yeah, and so sorry to not have a little bit better of an answer, but it would be unique if that happened again.
Okay, our next question is from Ann Barrett. Please describe in more detail what the easement actually says or does.
So the easements, again, it's a private agreement between the property owner and all subsequent owners in perpetuity and the Maryland National Capital Park and Planning Commission. And it is a document. It's sort of like a deed that gets recorded in the land records, and it contains a number of covenants. And so what the covenants do is they will lay out certain things that need to be approved by MNCPPC prior to them being done. It also lays out things that do not require approval, so that the kind of stuff that you can do without our permission. And then they also will have certain things that are prohibited, which is pretty limited because even outside of raising the primary structure, everything is kind of open to possibility. So again, they sort of function a lot like our historic preservation ordinance in that there's a lot of latitude for changes to be made to the property still. They just have to have the prior approval of MNCPPC before they can be done. So it doesn't freeze a place in time or a property in time or anything like that. And I think much like the HPC, the Historic Preservation Commission, when they are reviewing people's historic area work permit applications, I think that the easement committee at MNCPPC is pretty reasonable. And I think they want people to be able to use and enjoy the historic properties that they own and keep them in active use so that they don't sort of just become abandoned historic sites that nobody is using. But there are a couple of standard things in the easement. We want to maintain public access at some level, and generally that's defined as visual access. So if you've got a right of way from which the historic property is visible, the easement would probably prohibit building a fence or any shrubbery or things like that that completely hide the view of the property from the public right of way. We also try to not have other structures built on the site without permission. There's stuff like that. But at the end of the day, that's kind of all it is that you just have to ask for permission to make changes to the exterior, and occasionally, rarely, the interior too, if you get grant funds for an interior.
I'm trying to think of when the easement committee effectively, none of our property owners have wound up frustrated at the end of the process by the easement, as far as I can remember in my little role.
Right. Yeah. It's usually they're usually in agreement with the Historic Preservation Commission
because they're not there to tell the property owner what to do. They're there to protect the tax money investment.
Right.
So they're not a proactive body saying you must do this, you can't do this. They're more, gee, a heliport instead of the swimming pool idea. Those are probably two bad ideas for the early 19th century church building.
Right. Yeah, we've had, I think, it's definitely the kind of thing where like the HPC, the easement committee does try to sort of work with applicants through staff. So if there is something that they're not 100% on board with approving, they'll usually, instead of just rejecting it outright, they'll usually just send feedback, and maybe you could change this, maybe you could do this differently. And then we usually are able to make our way to some mutually agreeable outcome, which is nice too. And we do get some additional technical support. We try to be, and I say we as in staff, we try to be pretty, when we go out for these annual inspections, that is the one thing that is different too, in addition to the private nature of the agreement compared to the sort of public ordinance-based agreement between historic sites and the county. With the easements, we go out and we try to do monitoring inspections annually. We might not get to all of our 400 some historic sites annually, but we do try to make our way out to easements every year, every calendar year. So, and part of that is if we notice something wrong, we will bring it to your attention. And I don't mean wrong as in, you did something wrong, but just, as maybe we notice that a downspout's disconnected, and because of that, we can see that water is splashing back up onto the foundation, and you're getting biological growth on the water table, and little things like that could turn into larger problems if they're not addressed. We can sort of be a second set of eyes that might spot things that a property owner, just because you see it every day, you might not notice. And so we do try to offer some level of technical support, technical assistance in that way too.
I think for me, the best way of thinking of the easement part of this is it is possible for the county council to get rid of the Historic Preservation Commission and its work permits and the whole idea of preservation. At that point, the easement would be the only thing protecting the history of the house.
Right.
Otherwise, it's really a passive partnership, because the subtitle 29 and the Historic Preservation Commission is the bigger problem than the easement committee.
Thank you. I'm just going to read a couple of comments that are in the chat that go along with the easement discussion. From Gail Rothrock, she says that these easements have a public purpose, so not completely
Right.
a private agreement between the owner and MNC PPC. And then Franklin Robinson commented that easements are great. St. Thomas has had no problem, and they have 3 of them. So let me go back to.
We have a very nice relationship with the parish, and I think that is I think the relationship we have with St. Thomas Parish that Franklin is kind of getting at is we do think of them and hope that they are more of this sort of partnership with the property owners in perpetuity, and not, it's not the kind of thing that's supposed to feel like we're at odds with each other, and or anything like that. We like them to be relationships really with the property owners, and Gail is absolutely right too, and that's why they're so important, is because MNC PPC, as this sort of quasi-governmental entity, does want to ensure that the funds that come to the property and are invested in the property through the grant program are protected, because they're the public's funds that are going into these places. And we want to make sure that, if the commission gives, or the planning board gives money to restore a historic site or some feature of it, that it isn't removed by a subsequent property owner or what have you. And because then that sort of, it's just sort of a waste of the taxpayers' money. So that's no good.
It's important to bring up, you just brought something up. There are other grant programs in the United States. Most of them are sort of fancy loans. We'll loan you the money and
Right.
you will pay us back. This is a gift of the people of Prince George's County. You, the property owner, are getting free money.
Okay, so the last question, especially since you touched on it a little bit during this discussion, is from Lynn Roberts. She said that the earthquake of 2011 caused extensive damage to brick chimneys. Odenbui's house, Fairview, had 3 pull out of the timber framing, excuse me, while 1 collapsed entirely on the roof. Are there any ways in which emergency repairs to listed structures can be promptly done under any of the county's grant programs for the historic sites?
That is a very good question. So we used to have emergency grants, and I believe that we had gotten. I
can help you out here.
See them in my records. Yeah, yes, please do, because they haven't existed.
There used to be a source of small emergency grant money from a a sister organization of the Prince George's Historical Society, which is Heritage. I think that's their new name, Heritage Inc. in Bladensburg, which has a source of money, and they would give 2, 3, maybe up to 5,000, maybe a little more for this kind of the chimneys coming down. There's an emergency that needs to be handled. Now, they have had their own emergency for a few years, and those grants have not been available, though I'm expecting them to eventually become available again. The other, structurally, this grant program that we've talked about for this hour was put in place exactly because we needed some way to bolster preservation. I mean, that was the whole idea. And of course, it's more than an emergency. We were hoping that through the preservation program, we would work with property owners to whisper in their ears occasionally, gee, the chimney's about to fall over, but you've probably got another 6 months to a year. Hey, we have a grant program, right, to get you to say, we have noticed you have a problem brewing, and if you apply for the grant program, it's a little bit of work, but we'll help you fill this out, and you can save that chimney before it's lying on the roof.
Okay. And for those of us who've been involved in this whole process, the last comment and question from Gail Rothrock, I think, is a great way to end. She said that this program in Prince George's County is so far ahead of most programs that she knows of, and the staff and Historic Preservation Commission, we've all said the same thing, and she's asking, has there been any recognition of the state and at the state and national level of our program?
Not that I'm aware of.
Not that I'm aware of.
Yeah, unfortunately, no. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's a good thing that we fly under the radar. I don't know. It does seem odd, but
the preservation program in Prince George's County has many advanced programs, and some of our sister counties are busy seeking information to reinvent stuff that we've been doing for decades, because they quietly don't know that Prince George's County has been doing things for decades. So yeah, we fly below the radar because we're Prince George's.
Donna.
Yes, Lynn?
What about doing an article? You and Daniel and John do an article for maybe the entire newsletter would be just devoted to this and saying that very thing that Gail just said, because it may have been mentioned years ago, but it's due again, I think.
Well, I need an article for the next newsletter, Daniel, so maybe we can collaborate on something.
Okay, sure. Yeah, and I'm trying to think of I'm trying to remember, there's one other grant program sort of like this in New Jersey, I believe, and I can't remember exactly where. But
that's right. It's in the Trenton area, I think, central New Jersey. And
they were the subject of a lawsuit recently, which is why I say maybe it's about them.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yep.
And
that's
maybe
why
it's good that we fly
below
under
the radar is a good thing.
That's right. Nobody minds us any, and we just keep doing our good work, and it has its advantages.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. That looks like that's the end of our questions. So I want to thank Daniel and John Peter for tonight's conversation, and for everybody for joining us. If you enjoyed it, please think about donating to us or becoming a member, and you can do that through our website at www.pghistory.org. August's history chat is going to be about College Park Aviation Museum and the airport with he's not such the new director anymore, since he's been around since May of 2020, but we'll be just talking to Kevin Cabrera, who's been there and helping navigate the museum through the COVID situation. But he'll talk a little bit about, his visions for the museum and some of the upcoming things that are going to be happening. We hope you enjoyed tonight's talk. This, as you all know, has been recorded. We will be putting it up on our YouTube channel. I'll probably get around to that this weekend. So check out our YouTube channel or our website if you would like to share it with anybody or watch it again. And so in that case, good night, everybody, and see you next month.
Thank you.